I woke up in a hallway. Not a room. A hallway. Under a buzzing fluorescent light, with an 4 taped into the back of my hand and a blood pressure cuff still cinched around my arm. My daughter's recital dress, the little lavender one with the tulle skirt she twirled in for me that morning, was folded on the chair beside me because someone had needed the gurney space and moved it there instead of leaving it in her arms. I remember thinking, before I remembered anything else, that I hoped nobody had stepped on it. My phone was in a plastic bag with my shoes. When a nurse finally noticed I was awake and handed it to me, there was one text from my husband, sent 40 minutes earlier. Can't leave work for drama. Call me when you're discharged. Drama. That was the word he used for the moment I folded sideways in a folding chair at our daughter's dance recital in front of 40 other parents and didn't get back up. I lay there for a second with the phone screen lighting up my face. And then, because some old habit in me still wanted proof before I let myself feel anything, I opened Instagram. His assistant, Camille Everhart, had posted a story 20 minutes ago. A candlelit table, 2 wine glasses, a caption that just said good company, great food with a laughing emoji. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because it would be a better story if I'd broken down right there in the hallway and a kind stranger had held my hand. But I didn't. Something in me had already gone very quiet and very cold, the way water does right before it turns to ice. The restaurant was 6 minutes from his office. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. I didn't know yet, and some part of me had already decided I was done guessing. A nurse asked if there was anyone I wanted her to call. I said no. I asked for the discharge paperwork instead, and when it came, I read every line before I signed it, because that was the version of me that had survived the last 6 months, the one who read everything twice now. I handled the paperwork myself, signed everything, and knew the bill would arrive by mail in a few weeks. One more thing I'd deal with alone. I called a cab because I didn't trust myself to drive, and when I got home 3 hours later, my daughter, Adeline, was already asleep in her lavender dress because nobody had thought to change her out of it either. I stood in her doorway for a long time. Graham came in at 11. I heard the garage door, then his footsteps on the stairs, and then the particular way he always paused outside our bedroom door before opening it, like he was rehearsing something. He smelled like perfume that wasn't mine. Something warm and expensive, jasmine, and something underneath it I couldn't name. He asked how I was feeling. I said fine. He said he was sorry he couldn't get away, that the Wickham account was falling apart and someone had to hold the room. I said I understood. I turned off the lamp. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, because I hadn't told a single living soul, was that I'd called my attorney from the hospital parking lot before I ever called a cab. Her name was Harriet Vance, and I'd found her 4 months earlier, back when I was still telling myself I was just being careful. Back when I still thought maybe I was wrong. I should back up, because none of this happened in a single night. It happened in the small, deniable pieces that make up most marriages that are quietly ending, pieces so small that for a long time, I told myself I was the problem for noticing them. Graham and I met 11 years ago at a fundraising gala neither of us wanted to be at. He was funny in the dry, self-deprecating way that made a room lean toward him, and he looked at me across a room full of people who mattered and walked straight past all of them. 4 years, that felt like the truest thing anyone had ever done for me. We built a life that looked, from the outside, like the kind of life people envy. He ran the commercial real estate division at a firm downtown. I ran a small but well-regarded interior design studio out of a converted carriage house I'd inherited from my grandmother, the one asset in my name that had never touched our joint accounts. We had Adeline 7 years ago, after 2 losses I don't like to talk about, and when she was finally here and healthy, Graham cried in the delivery room in a way I'd never seen him cry before or since. For a long time it was good. I want to say that clearly, because this isn't a story about a marriage that was rotten from the start. It's a story about one that was slowly, deliberately hollowed out from the inside by someone who understood exactly how much I loved him and used that against me like a tool. The first thing I noticed was small. Graham hired a new executive assistant, Camille, the spring Adeline started first grade. She was sharp and capable, And for the first few months I liked her. She remembered my coffee order at the office holiday party. She sent Adeline a birthday card with a little hand-drawn giraffe on it. It was later, much later, that I understood how deliberate that kindness had been, how it had been designed to make me trust her. The late nights started slowly, one a week, then two. Graham always had a reason, and every reason was plausible on its own. A client dinner, a closing that ran long, a flight delay. It was only when I started keeping a small mental ledger, the way you do when something in your gut won't sit still, that the pattern became visible. Every late night matched a night Camille's own social media showed her, working late, somewhere that wasn't the office. I brought it up once, gently, on a Sunday morning over coffee. I didn't accuse him of anything. I just said I'd noticed how often their schedules seemed to overlap, and asked if there was something I should know. He laughed, not unkindly, just enough to make me feel small, and said I was letting new mom exhaustion turn into paranoia. He said Camille was the best assistant he'd ever had, and he wasn't going to make her feel unwelcome because I was insecure. I remember exactly how that landed. Not like an argument won, but like a door quietly closing somewhere inside me. I didn't bring it up again to him. But I did bring it up, once, to my sister, Ruth, over the phone on a Tuesday night when Adeline was already asleep. Ruth had never been Graham's biggest admirer. She told me at our wedding, half joking, that he had the smile of a man who'd never once had to apologize for anything and mean it. And when I told her what I'd noticed, she didn't laugh it off the way Graham had. She went quiet for a long moment, then asked me one question that stayed with me for months afterward. Are you keeping records of anything in case you need them someday? At the time, I told her I didn't want to think that way about my own marriage. She said that was fine, but she hoped I'd think about it anyway. I don't think I fully admitted, even to myself, how much that one question shaped everything I did next. Instead, I started paying attention in a different way, not to catch him, exactly, but to protect myself, though I couldn't have told you yet what I thought I needed protecting from. I opened a separate account at a bank 3 towns over, funded slowly with design studio income he never asked about, because the studio had always been mine, and he'd never cared to look closely at it. I started keeping copies of anything that mattered, the deed to the carriage house, my grandmother's trust documents, Adeline's medical records, in a fireproof box at my studio instead of at home. I told myself I was being careful. I didn't yet let myself use the word I was actually afraid of. 4 months before the recital, I finally used it. I sat in Harriet Vance's office on my lunch break, told her everything I'd noticed, and asked her, point blank, what I should be watching for if a marriage was heading somewhere I couldn't yet name. She was calm in a way that steadied me. She told me the 2 things that mattered most right now were documentation and patience. That suspicion wasn't evidence, but evidence was easy to lose if you waited too long to start gathering it. She told me to start pulling statements. Quietly, every account I had access to. That's what I was doing, one careful step at a time, on the night I collapsed at my daughter's recital. The collapse itself turned out to have an ordinary explanation, which somehow made it worse. Weeks of interrupted sleep, skipped meals, and a blood pressure that had been climbing for months under stress I hadn't let myself name. The doctor called it a vasovagal episode brought on by exhaustion and dehydration, and told me, not unkindly, that my body had essentially forced me to stop because I hadn't been willing to stop on my own. They kept me overnight for monitoring, ran an EKG that came back fine, and sent me home the next afternoon with instructions to rest and follow up with my primary doctor. It wasn't a crisis. It was a warning, and I understood, lying in that hospital bed alone, that it wasn't really my heart that had given out. It was everything else. Adeline asked me at breakfast the next morning why Daddy hadn't come to get me from the hospital. She was 7, old enough to notice the shape of an absence, even when she didn't have the words for it. I told her Daddy had been at work, and she nodded slowly, the way kids do when they're accepting an answer without believing it. She pushed her cereal around the bowl for a while, then asked if I was going to fall down again. I told her no, and I promised myself in that moment that I would find a way to make that true, no matter what it cost me. Ruth came over that same afternoon, unasked, with a casserole dish, and a look on her face that told me she'd already heard some version of the story from a mutual friend who'd been at the recital. She didn't say "I told you so," though she would have been entitled to. She just sat with me at the kitchen table while Adeline napped and asked how the folder was coming along, the one she'd nudged me toward starting months earlier. I hadn't shown it to anyone until that day, the statements, the studio deed, the slowly growing stack of screenshots. Ruth went through it page by page without saying much, and when she finished, she closed it gently and said, "It's time to stop just collecting and start using it." She was the one who sat with me while I called Harriet's office that evening to move up our next appointment. I went to Harriet's office again 3 days later, this time with the bank statements I'd been quietly collecting for 4 months, and something Harriet's own instincts had prepared her to look for: patterns in the joint accounts. What I found there was worse than an affair. 18 months earlier, Graham had opened a business line of credit against our house, the one asset that was actually in both our names, since the carriage house studio was mine alone, using a refinance he told me was for a home equity cushion in case the market turned. I remembered him mentioning it, vaguely, and signing something at our dining table late one night while distracted with Adeline's homework. I hadn't read it closely. I trusted him. That was the whole design. Over the following year, roughly $90,000 had moved out of that credit line and a joint savings account we'd built together since Adeline was born, money we'd always talked about as her future college fund. It hadn't gone to a client account or an investment. Piece by piece, in amounts small enough to avoid drawing my attention, it had gone toward funding a marketing consultancy. Camille's marketing consultancy. Graham wasn't just her boss. For the past year, he'd been her silent business partner and primary investor, using our money and never once putting his own name anywhere near the paperwork. There was more. Buried in a folder of documents Harriet's forensic accountant flagged was a partially completed form to add Camille as a secondary signer on the home equity line. The bank's records show the request had stalled months earlier. A routine compliance review had flagged inconsistencies in the paperwork and requested in-person verification before the change could go through, which Graham had quietly let lapse rather than show up and answer questions about it. He hadn't stolen the house yet. He'd only tried. I sat across from Harriet's desk holding the printed pages, and the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel devastated. I felt something closer to relief, the relief of finally being handed proof for a wound I'd been told for months was only in my head. "You were right to start collecting evidence before you said anything," Harriet told me. "If you'd confronted him the day you suspected, all of this could have quietly disappeared into cash withdrawals we'd never trace. Instead, we have a paper trail." She walked me through what came next in plain, unhurried terms, the way I'd come to appreciate about her. Nothing would happen quickly, she said, and nothing should. A rushed filing built on incomplete documentation was easier for a good defense attorney to pick apart than a slow one built on bank records that spoke for themselves. She wanted 2 more things before we moved: a formal accounting from a forensic specialist she worked with regularly, and a complete log of Adeline's school and activity calendar for the past year, cross-referenced against Graham's claimed work nights. I asked her why the second one mattered, since none of it involved money. "Because judges are people," she said, "and patterns matter to people. A man who wasn't where he said he was, over and over, is a man whose word means less every time he says it again." I left her office that day with a homework assignment instead of a decision, and for the first time in months, that felt like relief instead of a burden. I didn't say a word to Graham for the next 11 days. That's the part he still doesn't fully understand, even now that I already knew, and chose silence not out of weakness but out of strategy. Every night he came home smelling faintly of her perfume, I said nothing. Every excuse about the Wickham account, I nodded along to. I was gathering the last pieces Harriet needed, printed statements from the separate account he didn't know I had, a formal request to freeze the joint accounts filed the same week, and documentation from Adeline's school confirming every single event Graham had missed in the last year, cross-referenced against nights Camille's own social media placed her somewhere he'd claimed to be working. On the 12th day, I filed. Graham was served at his office, which I hadn't planned, and which Harriet later admitted she hadn't discouraged either. He called me 11 times in 40 minutes. I let all 11 calls go to voicemail, then finally answered the 12th, sitting in my studio with the fireproof box open on the table in front of me like a kind of shield. "You froze the accounts," he said, and his voice had a register I'd never heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but the panic of a man watching a structure he thought was permanent begin to come apart. "Sarah, we can talk about this. Whatever you think you found, I can explain it." "You can explain it to Harriet," I said, "and to the bank's fraud investigator." I already scheduled that meeting for Thursday. There was a long silence, and then, quietly, he asked the question I think he'd been building toward the whole call. "Is this about Camille?" "It was at first," I said. "Now it's about $90,000 of our daughter's college fund and a stalled bank form with Camille's name on it that you never explained." He didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in 11 years, Graham Calder didn't have a smooth explanation ready, and the silence on the other end of the line told me everything I still needed to know. He tried a different approach 2 days later, showing up at my studio unannounced during working hours, standing in the doorway between my fabric samples and a client's half-finished mood board like he still had a right to walk into any room I occupied. He said he wanted to talk without lawyers in the room, just the two of us, the way we used to work through hard things. I told him there was no version of just the two of us left that I trusted, and that anything he wanted to say could go through Harriet like everything else now would. He left angrier than I'd ever seen him, and for a moment, standing there afterward with my hands shaking, I almost doubted myself. Then I remembered the stalled form with Camille's name on it, and the doubt went quiet. His mother called next, which I hadn't expected. Dolores had never been unkind to me in 11 years, and she wasn't unkind on the phone either. She was careful, almost pleading, asking if there wasn't some way to work through this privately for Adeline's sake. I told her I understood she loved her son, but that I wasn't willing to protect him from consequences he'd built for himself, and that Adeline deserved a mother who wasn't afraid to say so out loud. She didn't call again after that, though she did send Adeline a birthday card that year, which I let her keep. The months that followed were not fast, and I'd learned enough by then not to expect them to be. Harriet had warned me early on, these cases move on their own schedule, and anyone promising a quick resolution is either inexperienced or lying to make you feel better. The forensic accountant's full report took nearly 10 weeks. The bank's internal review into the stalled equity line request took even longer because it had to be handled separately from the divorce filing itself, coordinated through their own compliance department rather than through the court. Harriet's forensic accountant, a quiet, methodical man named Oswin Prescott, walked me through the full trail one afternoon with a highlighter and 3 years of statements spread across a conference table. He showed me how the withdrawals had been staggered deliberately, never a round number, never large enough on its own to trigger the bank's fraud alerts, always timed a few days after a paycheck deposit, so the account balance looked ordinary to anyone glancing at it in passing. "Whoever set this up," he said, understood exactly how much scrutiny an account gets and how much it doesn't. I didn't tell him it had been my own husband studying our life together with that kind of care. I didn't need to. By then, the pattern spoke plainly enough on its own. What we learned, piece by piece, filled in a picture I'd only half seen. Camille's consultancy had never actually turned a profit. Most of the money Graham funneled into it had gone toward rent on an office suite neither of them needed yet, a leased car registered in the business's name, and a second apartment, the one where I now understood most of those late nights had actually happened. Camille herself, when questioned as part of the bank's review, told investigators she believed the money was legitimately Graham's personal savings, invested the way any silent partner might invest in a promising business. Whether that was true or a story she'd rehearsed for exactly this moment, I never fully learned, and eventually I stopped needing to know. What mattered was the paper trail, and the paper trail didn't care what either of them believed. The stalled attempt to add Camille to the equity line was the piece that turned the case from a messy divorce into something with real teeth. Because it had touched jointly held property, our house, the bank flagged the pattern internally and referred the matter to law enforcement for review, separate from the divorce proceedings. It moved slowly, the way Harriet had promised these things do. Almost a year later, it was still an open review rather than a closed case, working its way through subpoenaed bank records and a forensic accounting comparison that would eventually become the deciding piece of evidence. The divorce itself resolved faster, though faster still meant the better part of a year. Because the carriage house studio had always been solely mine, inherited, never touched by joint funds, meticulously documented in exactly the way Harriet had trained me to document everything else. It was never in question. The house we'd shared as a family was refinanced in my name alone, with Graham's equity share offset against the restitution he now owed to the joint accounts he drained, so that in practice, very little cash ever needed to change hands at all. Custody of Adeline came down, in the end, not to the affair. Harriet had told me from the start that courts rarely weigh infidelity heavily on its own but to attendance. To a documented pattern, pulled straight from the school's own event records, showing that in the year before the recital, Graham had missed 9 of Adeline's 11 school functions, including the night I collapsed in a folding chair with no one beside me. I was granted primary custody with a structured, clearly defined parenting schedule for Graham rather than the open access he'd once assumed he'd always have. Adeline adjusted slowly, the way children do, not in one clean turn but in small, uneven steps. For the first month after Graham moved into an apartment across town, she asked most nights at bedtime whether he was coming back. I never lied to her, but I learned to answer in the smallest true piece I could manage. Daddy has his own home now, and you'll see him on the days we planned. Around the 3rd month, the questions changed shape. She started asking whether it was her fault, because she'd heard some vague, garbled version of money problems from a classmate whose parents had been talking about ours at pickup. I sat her down that night and told her, as plainly as a 7-year-old could understand, that grown-up money mistakes were never a child's fault, not even a little, and that nothing she had done or could ever do would change how much either of us loved her. She cried, and then she asked if she could still call Camille, Miss Camille, if she saw her somewhere, and I told her that decision belonged to her, not to me, which seemed to settle something in her more than any reassurance I'd offered so far. Camille, for her part, made one attempt to reach out to me directly, showing up unannounced at my studio 4 months after the filing, apparently hoping to explain her side of things before the bank's review concluded. I didn't let her in. Over the following weeks, she tried again twice more, and began sending messages through a mutual acquaintance after I had made clear I wanted no further contact. Once it became a repeated pattern rather than a single lapse in judgment, Harriet sent a formal cease and desist letter on my behalf, laying out the contact history in writing. Camille stopped after that. My studio, through all of it, became the one place that felt entirely untouched by any of it, and in a strange way, the thing that carried me through. Word had gotten around quietly among my clients that I was going through a hard year, and instead of the pity I braced for, what I got was work. A longtime client referred me to her sister for a full home renovation. Another asked me to consult on a boutique hotel lobby, a project bigger than anything I'd taken on before. I said yes to all of it, partly because the income mattered more than ever, and partly because sketching floor plans at midnight was easier than lying awake in a house that still smelled, faintly and infuriatingly, like a marriage that hadn't finished ending. By the time the divorce was finalized, the studio had grown enough that I hired my first full-time employee, a bright, exacting young designer named Colette who reminded me, on the hard days, of exactly how much I still had left to build. Ruth stayed close through all of it, in the unglamorous way Real support usually looks, picking Adeline up from school on hearing days, sitting in the hallway outside Harriet's office during the longest meetings, never once making me feel like a burden for needing her. A year into the process, she told me she'd started keeping her own folder, just in case, after watching what almost happened to me. I hope she never needs it. I told her I hoped that too, and that I was glad, at least, that she'd never have to learn the hard way why the folder mattered. I kept waiting, through all of it, for the moment I'd feel triumphant. It never quite arrived the way I expected. What arrived instead, slowly, was something quieter and more durable, The feeling of my own name back on the deed to my own house, my daughter's college fund partially restored through the restitution order, and rebuilt the rest of the way through my own studio's steadily growing client list, and evenings that were mine again, uninterrupted by the sound of a garage door and footsteps that used to make me brace myself before they even reached the bedroom. Almost 2 years later, the law enforcement review into the equity line matter finally reached resolution, a restitution order covering the full amount diverted from our accounts, with interest, and a formal record that will follow Graham through any future licensing or background review in his industry. He never faced anything beyond that. There was no dramatic courtroom reckoning, no moment where he broke down and admitted everything on the stand. Mostly, it just ended the way these things tend to end in real life, with paperwork and signatures, and a judge reading a settlement into the record in a flat, unremarkable voice. Graham was there for that final hearing, sitting beside an attorney of his own, looking smaller somehow than the man who used to fill every room he walked into. When the judge asked if he understood the terms of the restitution order, he said, "Yes, Your Honor," in a voice that had none of the old smoothness left in it. He didn't look at me on his way out. I found, when the moment actually arrived, that I didn't need him to. I sat in the gallery with Harriet beside me and felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely unafraid of what came next. Adeline is 9 now. She still dances, though she's moved past the lavender leotard into something more advanced, and I have never once missed a recital since. I sit in the second row every time, phone in my bag and turned all the way off, because I learned the hard way what it costs to be the only parent watching. Last spring, at her end-of-year recital, Graham came too, sitting a respectful distance away on his assigned days per the parenting schedule, and afterward he waited his turn while Adeline ran to me first with her medal, breathless, before she circled back to show him. It was, for a moment, almost ordinary. 2 parents at the edge of a gymnasium, clapping for the same small, glowing girl. He caught my eye once, briefly, and something passed between us that wasn't warmth exactly, but wasn't hostility either. Just the quiet acknowledgement of 2 people who'd once built something together and had since learned, at great cost, how much of it had never really been real. I nodded once. He nodded back. Then Adeline pulled my sleeve to show me a scuff on her new shoes, and the moment passed, the way most moments do now, into the ordinary business of raising a daughter who is, against every odd that year handed her, turning out just fine. I think sometimes about that hallway, the buzzing light, the dress folded on a chair because there was no one there to hold it, the text that called the worst night of my life drama. I don't think about it with anger anymore, mostly. I think about it as the night I stopped waiting to be believed and started building the kind of proof no one could talk me out of. Graham didn't know. That night he came home smelling like someone else's perfume, and I said nothing at all, that the silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a door, quietly, carefully, being built to close behind him. If you'd found what I found, sitting alone in a hospital hallway, already knowing in your gut something was wrong, would you have stayed silent and gathered your proof first, or confronted him the moment he walked through the door? Tell me in the comments.